Hi, my name is Sindhu Prasad, and I'm the Head of Data Management at the George Institute for Global Health. And today I'll be providing some training on data sharing. The agenda for this training session will cover the what and why of data sharing, why data sharing is complicated, considerations when sharing data ownership, the types of data sharing that are available, data sharing agreements, when to plan data sharing, and finally having a look at some case studies. Firstly, what is data sharing? It is the practice of making data available to other research stakeholders, including other organizations and investigators. It is part of the data lifecycle, and generally it is post data collection, use and analysis that data sets are made available to share with others. It's important to note that not all data can or should be shared due to privacy, sensitivity and confidentiality aspects. Data risks, data security and data quality may also impact when and what you share and with whom. Permissions on usage may limit how broadly or freely you may be able to share. And finally, intellectual property. The reasons for sharing data are manifold, and the global trend is for more and more of this to happen. So the Responsible Code of Conduct for Research across many countries covers data sharing. And this is really to foster collaborations which are supported by contractual requirements, etc. for sharing. On top of this, you've got increasing demand from funders and publishers for researchers to share the data. From the funders' perspective, increasing reuse of data means that they help improve research integrity and contribute to a stronger knowledge economy. From the publisher's perspective, they require authors to make all data necessary to replicate their study's findings publicly available without restriction at the time of publication. So not all funders and not all publishers are going down this road, but certainly the number is increasing. And the reasons for this are to ensure reproducibility, validation of findings, and transparency of findings. The idea is that all of this leads to innovation, improvements, and new findings, which will ultimately benefit society. The cost-saving aspect is another important one because it is generally cheaper to reuse data that's already been collected, generated, rather than going out to collect a new data set. Data sharing is complicated by many factors, and one of the primary ones is personal identifying information. PII is any data item or combination of multiple data items that can be used to directly identify an individual project participant. The collection, processing, storage, sharing and destruction of this PII must always ensure the protection of the confidentiality of the project participants and ensure that the PII data is only used for the purpose for which it was consented. Sensitive information is a subset of PII that also requires high levels of protection and handling. Examples of sensitive information includes an individual's health related information, their racial or ethnic origin, information about their political opinions, membership of political associations, professional or trade associations or trade unions, religious beliefs or affiliations, philosophical beliefs, sexual orientation or practices, criminal records, or biometric information. This list is by no means extensive, and the recommendation is that you check what the PII and sensitive data definitions are for the countries within which you are operating. This map is from DLA Piper, and it basically summarizes the different levels of data protection laws of the world. Different countries have different regulations. Some are more stringent, and these are highlighted in red, and some are not as stringent, which are highlighted in green. And you've got countries that are orange and yellow in between. So anytime you are sharing data, accessing information, it's helpful to keep this in mind, because this is one of the reasons why care needs to be taken when we are thinking about the source of the data that we have and the destination of where that data is going, and whether the regulations actually allow that transfer to happen. So the regulations are overlaid with more complexities, and this includes things like data ownership, what the individual consented to, what ethics has approved for that data, the storage and security requirements, any contracts that may affect any of this sharing and access, data set preparation or really desensitization, so things like de-identification and anonymization processes, budget, timeline, and expertise, of course, also influence why data sharing can get complicated. There are many things we need to consider when sharing data. So I'll go through these 6 key points. Can we share? What to share? Why to share? When should we share? Who do we share with? And how the data and outcomes will be shared and used. So if you look at can we share, the things to consider here are data ownership or data license, seeing whether it's a single or multiple organization ownership model, what the individual has consented to, if there are any risks of re-identifying individuals if you share the data, looking at the contractual, legislative, ethical, and fund obligations in sharing the data. So what, under what conditions have you been sponsored and funded and approved to run this project? How does this relate to data sharing and what you should be doing? Data quality is a very important one. Obviously, if you share data that is of poor quality, then that can really compromise individual researcher reputation, but also the organization that they're affiliated with. IP confidentiality and the risks of sharing are also things that we consider when we are asking the question, can we share the data? In terms of what to share, we should be thinking about the personal, sensitive, and confidential information that might be in the data set. And then the question to ask is whether all data needs to be shared or only a subset. And this is where things like desensitization, de-identification, anonymization come in. When looking at why to share, it's important to understand the purpose, the reasoning behind why you are sharing data. Is it actually a valid and acceptable reason, and is it ethical? In terms of when, at what stage should you share? Will it compromise the opportunity for the data owner if you share it too early? In terms of who to share with, can it be anyone, authorized people only, or no one? In terms of how the data and outcomes will be shared and used, is it acceptable and approved? Is the use ethical? Will secure data sharing methods be used? So as you can see, there's a huge number of considerations and decision points. So very important that this awareness is there to help you plan and share data responsibly. Let's have a look at data ownership and sharing next. So a few definitions. When we say data ownership, this means legal rights, complete control and responsibility of the data. By license, we mean a legal arrangement between the data owner and the data user for that data use. So where this comes into play is really the decision making about who can make the decision to share the data. So if the data is owned by an organization, they can decide to share the data. If the data is not owned by the organization and sharing is within what the data license granted covers, then the organization can decide to share the data. But if the data is not owned by the organization or the sharing is outside what the data license covers, then the organization can't share data. And in some instances, they may not even have a license to own shares. So very important to consider ownership and license when you are looking at whether you've actually got the ability as an organization to make the decision or not. Next, we will look at the different types of data sharing. So different data are shared differently depending on the factors such as privacy, sensitivity, confidentiality, risks, permissions on usage, etc. So a lot of the things that I've covered in my previous slides. On the one end of the spectrum, we have got closed data. This basically means that only the organization has access, and in many cases, it could be just particular individuals within the organization that have access. In the middle, we have shared data. So this is a really controlled access to the right people for the right reasons. And finally, on the open end, we have open data, which is publicly released data information for anyone to access. So when you're thinking about data sharing, it's important to think about how you will share, whether it'll be closed, whether it'll be shared or open data. Next, we will look at data sharing agreements. So this is just a very generic life cycle that you may come across. So you might get a request from somebody outside the organization for data. There'll be a process to review and assess that request and make a decision. If the organization can't share or there is no approval to share, then the data should not be shared. So that's a pretty hard stop. If, on the other hand, the organization does have ownership or license to share and it's been approved, and consent and ethics and all those sorts of things have also been addressed, then a data sharing agreement should be set up and data access can be granted. In terms of who is involved, different organizations will have different processes for how they manage this. So some of the usual groups that can be involved in this include the data sharing committee, data custodians, project investigators, the legal team, statistics, and IT. Next, we will move on to data sharing agreements. So these are legal binding contracts that facilitate responsible data sharing. And these are set up between the data owner and the data requester. In some cases, it could be the group that's got the data license as well. The list of the different items that data sharing agreements cover are listed here. This is not exhaustive, but this gives you an indication of the different elements that go to make a data sharing agreement. It will include the details of the organizations that are involved, so who's the giver, the provider, who's the receiver. The purpose of the sharing and duration are covered, along with conditions of data access. This includes things like who will have access and the security measures that need to be in place. License terms to use the data will be provided along with privacy confidentiality considerations. Intellectual property, breach and liability sections will also be available. So I urge you to reach out to your legal team. Generally, they are the group that set up data sharing agreements and they may be able to share their template with you. Looking at when to plan data sharing, we really should start at the very beginning. So plan to share your data from the start of the project and set up processes accordingly. This planning should be reviewed and adjusted as you need, but as I've talked through in all of my previous slides, there's a number of decisions that need to be made. And the sooner you start planning for it, the sooner you can set up processes that will allow you to reach those goals. Some of the things to consider when you are beginning your project is that you really need to think beyond the primary research purpose and the primary collaborators. Think about who your future potential target audience could be for the data sharing. Determine data ownership. If it's multiple organizations, then what is the decision-making process for data sharing and who can make the decisions and how? If your organization is not the data owner, then what rights will be needed to allow you to share data, or perhaps even reuse it? You'll have to determine the individual consent requirements. So for example, restrict the data to primary purpose only, or allow reuse for secondary purpose under specific conditions, or perhaps no conditions. So this will vary project to project. It might even, if you've got a global project, it might even be, different consent requirements for different countries. So very important to think about this and how it ties to your future data sharing scenarios. Another important thing to think about is how the data will be de-identified or anonymized. Obviously, you collect personal information, sensitive information for purpose, and there will be perhaps an opportunity to desensitize that to make that easier for data sharing. So what does that look like? So I'm going to finish with a couple of case studies. So these are just examples of different data sharing scenarios and the complexities that can unfold at the end of projects. So really it's to highlight the importance of reviewing the data sharing requests, planning, etc., with very close detail, and making sure that you do plan well in advance and do consider all of the different aspects that I have mentioned to help you share responsibly. So the first one is data ownership. It can be that the data owner is not very clearly identified. An organization may have the data but no license to on-share with another entity. Or it could be that you need approval from a Ministry of Health from one country as a prerequisite for sharing data collected in that country for secondary use. So important to have this clarified. Looking at data set privacy and sensitivity aspects, you might be collecting videos, capturing videos, audio files and transcripts, photographs even. So all of that can be PII and sensitive information. And the countries such as China and Europe, with their regulations, will have very strict boundaries on what can and can't be done with this content. So here you'd be thinking about your de-identification and anonymization requirements to really desensitize this content, unlink the private personal information from the research data. If you do get a request from an external group, something to be mindful of is the number of people that will be listed as requiring access to that data set once transferred. So obviously there's practical implications for this, but it is a red flag if a high number of individuals are listed as requiring access to the data set. Generally, you are sharing data. It should only be for a controlled purpose with select individuals. So do ask how many people the data is going to be seen shared access by, and this will help your decision making, or at least de-risk the concerns here. And looking at ethics as part of reviewing data sharing is important because you might not actually have approval for secondary use of data. And finally, security considerations. So it might be that the recipient wants to use Dropbox, or they might just say, just send me an email. So generally, these are not secure ways of sharing data. And when data sharing agreements are set up, then obviously there's, stipulation of clauses about the mechanisms and the tools that we use for data sharing. So very important to keep security at the forefront, because the last thing that you'd want is to share data and for there to be a breach with wherever that destination point was. So this includes things like cloud software. They need careful consideration to know exactly where the physical location of their data is and who in the back end may have access. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.